palace was finished on a Tuesday. The war began on Wednesday. For 200 years, historians have treated this as a coincidence, one of those strange accidents of timing that history occasionally produces. It was not a coincidence. The man who built the palace knew the war was coming. He knew the exact day it would begin, and he made certain, down to the final nail, that his palace would be complete before it did. The question that no one has been able to answer is how he knew. The palace stood in the forests of northern Russia, near a river whose name has been changed 3 times since. It was commissioned in 1789 by a nobleman named Count Mikhail Volkov, a man who, by every surviving account, was unremarkable in almost every way. He was not a general. He was not a politician. He held no position of influence at the imperial court. He was, as one contemporary described him, a man who preferred maps to people. Maps. That detail will matter later. Volkov began construction on his palace in the spring of 1789, and from the very beginning he did something that confused everyone around him. He set a deadline, not a general one, not within a few years, a specific date, the 4th of August, 1792. 3 years, almost to the day, from when construction began. He told his architects the palace had to be finished by that date, not a day later. When they asked why, he would not say. For 3 years, Count Volkov drove the construction with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He paid double wages to keep workers through the winter. He imported materials at extraordinary cost to avoid delays. When a section of the eastern wing fell behind schedule, he had it rebuilt working through the night by torchlight. The workers thought he was mad, but they took his money, and the palace rose, season by season, toward a deadline only Volkov understood. He kept a private journal throughout the construction, a document now held in a regional archive, its authenticity confirmed, but its contents rarely studied. The entries are mostly mundane: costs, schedules, disputes with suppliers. But every few pages, a different kind of entry appears, shorter, written in a different ink, always containing the same thing: a countdown. 3 years remaining. Then 2 years remaining. Then 1 year remaining. A countdown to a date Volkov never explained. A date he treated not as a goal, but as a deadline he could not afford to miss. The palace was completed on the 4th of August, 1792, exactly on schedule, exactly as Volkov had demanded 3 years earlier. The final entry in his construction journal is dated that evening. It reads, "It is finished. 1 day. That is all the margin I was given. 1 day." The following morning, the 5th of August, 1792, news reached the region that would change everything. A war had begun. Not a distant war. Not a rumor of conflict in some far province. A war that within weeks would sweep directly through the forests of northern Russia, through the very valley where Volkov had built his palace. He had finished 1 day before it arrived. Here is what makes this story impossible to explain. In 1789, when Volkov set his deadline, there was no war on the horizon, no tension, no diplomatic crisis, no massing of armies. The conflict that began on the 5th of August, 1792, was triggered by events that, in 1789, had not yet happened. Volkov set a deadline 3 years in advance for a war that nothing in 1789 could have predicted. And he was right, to the day. How? That is the question I want you to hold on to, because the answer, when researchers finally found it in 1953, was not what anyone expected. It was hidden in the one thing Volkov loved more than people: his maps. It was hidden in his maps. In 1953, more than a century and a half after Count Volkov died, a researcher cataloguing a regional archive found a sealed wooden case that had never been opened. It contained Volkov's personal map collection. The researcher expected the usual: regional surveys, property boundaries, the kind of documents a nobleman who preferred maps to people might accumulate over a lifetime. That is not what the case contained. The maps were unlike anything the researcher had seen. They were maps of the region, the forests, the rivers, the roads, but they were annotated, densely, in Volkov's handwriting, and the annotations did not describe what the region was. They described what it would become. One map showed troop movements through the valley, drawn in 1789, 3 years before any army marched through it. And the movements matched, almost exactly, the path the war would actually take. Another showed which villages would burn. Another marked which bridges would be destroyed. Another traced the retreat of an army that, in 1789, had not yet been formed. Volkov had not predicted the war. He had mapped it, in detail, years before it happened. The researcher who found these maps spent the rest of his career trying to explain them. He considered every rational possibility. Perhaps Volkov was a spy, privy to military secrets. But the war was triggered by events that post-dated the maps. There were no secrets to leak in 1789, because the decisions had not been made. Perhaps the maps were forged later, drawn after the war and backdated. But the paper, the ink, and the binding were all authenticated to the period. The maps were genuinely made in 1789. Perhaps it was simply an extraordinary series of lucky guesses. But there were too many. Troop movements, village by village, bridges, one by one, dates accurate to the week. A lucky guess does not get the date right to the day. He never found an explanation that satisfied him. And here is where it gets stranger. Among the maps was one final document. Not a map of the region, a map of the palace itself. Every room, every corridor, every window. And on this map, Volkov had marked something in the center of the structure. A small room on the ground floor, unremarkable in the architectural plans. Next to it, he had written 4 words. This is why. Build here. The room was not special in any way the architecture revealed. It was small, plain, positioned, for no obvious reason, at the precise geographic center of the entire palace. When researchers located the room in the surviving ruins, they found it had been built differently from everything around it. The walls were thicker, the foundation deeper, and the floor was made of a single slab of stone that did not match any other material used in the palace. Whatever Volkov built that palace to protect, he put it in that room. And he made certain the palace was finished, and that room was sealed, one day before the war that he had somehow already seen arrive to test it. The palace did not survive the war intact. The eastern wing burned, the towers fell. Over 2 centuries, the forest reclaimed most of what remained, but the central room survived. The thick walls held, the deep foundation held. The single slab of stone floor remained exactly where Volkov had placed it. When the room was finally examined in 1953, it was empty. Whatever had been inside was gone. There was no way to know when it had been removed, or by whom, or what it had been. There was only the room, built to survive a war that one man saw coming 3 years early, sealed one day before that war arrived, and emptied, at some point in the 200 years since, by someone who knew exactly where to look. Count Mikhail Volkov died in 1798. His maps were sealed in a case and forgotten for 155 years. We know he mapped a war before it happened. We know he built a palace to be finished one day before it began. We know he built one room at the center to survive what was coming. We do not know how he knew. We do not know what he put in that room. And we do not know who took it. What do you think was inside that room? And how do you think Volkov knew what was coming? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. A man who preferred maps to people once drew the future in ink and built a palace to protect whatever that future required him to hide. Some men build palaces to be remembered. This one built a palace to keep a secret. If you want to know about the palace that appears on no map, that officially never existed, yet still stands, that story is coming next. Subscribe, and I will see you there. One final thing. The Count, the palace, and the maps are fictional constructions built from real historical patterns. The question underneath this story is worth asking.